All right, High Rollers, thrilled today to have this guy back on. We've had him on a few times before, the author of Reading Poker Tells, Verbal Poker Tells, and now Exploiting Poker Tells, the third book in his epic trilogy on tells and poker psychology. One of the most respected guys in the game with his video series, his blog, his books, of course. He's also coached some of the biggest names in poker. A Poker Player on Twitter, readingpokertells.com, the website. Zachary Elwood, welcome back to the show, man. Congrats on the new book, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Derek. Good to be here. That's very nice of you. I appreciate epic.
Well, I mean, it is epic. It's, let's face it, there's not much material out there on tells, and you've got a wonderful 3-book series on the subject.
Oh, well, thank you. I do what I can.
Before we talk about your books, though, I want to talk about, again, the latest offering is Exploiting Poker Tells. But can you give us a sense of tells in general? Are they everywhere, pervasive, just permeating all around us at the poker table? Are they just there and most people don't spot them?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. I'd say in general, they're a small part of playing good live poker, It's definitely a minor part of the game. Strategy and thinking out your strategy is much more important. Tells are like, kind of like people have called them the icing on the cake. Usually versus decent players, they're not going to be a big deal, not going to be a big factor. But then you play some players who are quite inexperienced, even at very high stakes. Some players just give a lot away on a regular basis with their behavior. And so you have a range of it going from like a small thing that could be a slight, mind maker upper in one subtle spot to like having somebody who's super obvious. So yeah, it varies, but in general, it's a small helper in adding to your win rate.
I've always found that interesting about you because you've always said that it's just a small part of poker. Most people, when they delve into a subject as thoroughly as you have, they really boost it up like this is the most important thing. But you're basically saying get good at strategy, good at the math, good at the fundamentals, and this will help increase your win rate significantly if you can employ these in certain spots as well.
Yeah, I never wanted to give a unrealistic view of them. I think that's what a lot of people that talk about them do wrong. They come at it from like this marketing kind of angle. I mean, it's just as important that people have a realistic view of stuff as it is to know about the actual tells. It's good to be realistic and to have the right expectation. Otherwise, you get unrealistic expectations and you write off tells or whatever.
You have a trained eye in the area. I'm wondering, when did you become fascinated with this subject, with tells at the poker table?
Well, I played for a living, for 3 years. That was my only source of income. And, I was interested in psychology before that. I used to read psychology books when I was a kid and just found them interesting. And, so I always had that basic interest in psychology. And that was what interested me when I played poker as a kid, But of course, when you're young, you have, kind of romantic ideas of tells being very important, But then, once you start playing more, you realize the more realistic aspect of them. But yeah, I've just always been long interested in psychology and studying people. And so, yeah, it's just a natural outgrowth of that, yeah.
I was trying to think of questions I haven't asked you before. Again, we've had you on a few times. I came up with this one. Do poker tells only happen at the table? I mean, theoretically, the game continues during breaks, the dinner break of tournaments. People are always going outside for smoke breaks in cash games. Are tells the kind of thing that, you're working once you enter the casino? You should be looking for them all the time?
Well, I mean, I think there's a limit to how much you can get off somebody just from looking at them, or they're off the poker table, behavior. I mean, there's definitely some things you can sometimes draw conclusions about how experienced someone is just by how they talk about non-poker stuff, or just talking about the game in general. If you know that they're a professional in some other area or whatever, you might have certain reads about them. But I think there's definitely a limit to that. I mean, I think basically you just have to watch people at the poker table, and that's where the majority of the information comes into play. Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm wondering, is there a famous hand in poker, one that most avid players would have seen and maybe more than once, where you spotted an obvious tell and maybe can break it down? A popular hand in poker history that you've talked about before?
Well, yeah, there was one from, I think it was High Stakes Poker, where it was Daniel Negreanu and Antonio Esfandiari, where Negreanu, did a lot of talking, and he bluffed all in on the flop. Well, he didn't bluff. It was like second pair, and then Esfandiari had like an under pair, but he beat Negreanu, and Negreanu just talked a lot, and I talked about it in Verbal Poker Tells. I thought there were like several things that he gave away, that probably influenced Antonio to call if he noticed them. But even if he didn't, they were kind of signs that he was giving away some of his weakness, And I gave like 2 or 3 breakdowns of specific spots when he was talking in Verbal Poker Tells that gave away some of his weakness there, basically.
Well, that's interesting because certainly Antonio Esfandiari is a guy you don't want to be giving tells away to. I mean, the guy, his hand reading ability alone is super strong, and then Daniel Negreanu, I mean, an elite pro, even he can give away tells. That's interesting.
Well, Negreanu's really good at staying balanced. I think it was an unusual spot because it was fairly on, I think, and, poker being televised, and Negreanu, I think, was trying to be really talkative, even though he might not have been that comfortable with it, but he was trying to, be cool. I think it was just a weird spot. Like, I don't think Negreanu in general gives away much of anything, but there were a couple spots that I thought were just, highly likely to indicate weakness there. And, it was an unusual spot because, Negreanu knows what he's doing with the talking and is generally very, very balanced. In that hand, there was a spot where on the flop, Antonio bets, and then Negreanu just ships it in with like ace-10 on a queen-10 X board. And so Negreanu could have easily been ahead, but he wasn't. Antonio had jacks. And so when Negreanu ships it in and Antonio is thinking, Negreanu almost immediately goes, phew, I'm glad he didn't snap call or something like that. So that's one of the things he did. And like when somebody does the like immediate relief over somebody not snap calling, that's almost always going to be, actual gladness that somebody didn't snap call with, a set or whatever. So, in that case, it's just highly unlikely that anybody fakes that. Like I basically have never seen anybody fake that. Like that would be such a high level fake that nobody, and nobody would know how anybody would react to it mostly. So it's like, I've basically never seen it faked. So that was one little clue that Negreanu was like far from the top of his range, to give a little bit of genuine relief that he wasn't snap called. So that was one little example. I've seen examples of that in high stakes tournaments too, because it's not a well known thing, and people think, oh, maybe they could be balanced, but like just nobody's thinking that far ahead where they're like they know exactly how their opponent is going to perceive that little statement,
Right. It's amazing. It's really a wonderful subject, and the more you get into it, the more you're fascinated by it. Your latest book, Exploiting Poker Tells, a fabulous trilogy. I mean, the testimonials from each book are incredible, and they come from some of the biggest names in the industry, too. You must be pleased with that. Tell us about the new book and how it sort of continues along the path of reading poker tells and verbal poker tells.
This book is focused on physical behaviors. I was very proud of Verbal Poker Tells for the verbal part of it, and this was kind of an update and going into more practical detail about the physical stuff, because I think my first book was good on a really general high level, thinking about breaking down behaviors into categories. But I think this the new book is meant to be like, let's delve into like actual hands. So there's like 140 plus hand histories, and it goes into details about like what factors am I or another player or someone in general, what factors should people be looking at and taking into account, and like what behaviors can be ignored for whatever reason. So it's like a much more practical, like hand history based book. It's all hands with a little bit of a framework for how to think about high level behavior patterns.
Yeah, you've got some interviews with pros in there as well. You've got a quiz. And on your website, again, readingpokertells.com, you ask a couple of questions. You just mentioned them there. What are the factors involved when good reads are made? What situational factors should be considered? And which behavior should be ignored? Can you give us an example of maybe a behavior that should be ignored at the poker table?
Yeah, there was one I broke down to a couple different spots in the book. It was, like generally when somebody does uncertain behaviors when they're betting, like shrugging kind of behaviors or, uncertain behaviors when they're betting. And generally it's going to indicate strength or relaxation, just because bluffers don't like to indicate those kind of things. But, one instance where it would be wrong to draw much conclusion is when somebody goes all in and then somebody asks them how much they have and they make shrugging gestures, like basically indicating, I don't know how much I have, or, acting uncertain. Like that's not a spot that it would be smart to draw much information from, just because, people with both strong hands and weak hands are capable of shrugging in that spot and acting like, oh, I don't know how much I have. I've heard people like try to analyze that spot before, but I don't think it contains much meaning, just because you can easily imagine both bluffers and players betting strong hands, like wanting to act cavalier in that spot and act like, oh, I don't know how much I have, you count it or whatever, and practice like I haven't seen any correlation with it. So.
I mean, there's so much that goes into it, and you've studied it in depth. And I guess there are certain tells, like you just said, that in certain spots mean one thing, and in other spots mean absolutely nothing.
Right, like if somebody was bluffing all in on the river, for example, and they did a little hands up, palms up, shrugging gesture, it'd be likely that they were strong and relaxed. But if they were doing it, if they did the same thing when someone asked them right after, like how big's your stack, and they did the same gesture, I would think that would not be meaningful just because of the situation. So it's kind of like things like that where it's like, don't make the mistake of reading into it, and here's why.
How do successful poker players, first of all, take those tells that they spot at the table, read them, analyze them, and then use them to their advantage? I mean, it's got to take experience, right?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely takes experience, and I think that's, honestly, I think a lot of people would have it's probably fairly hard to make use of a lot of the stuff in my books just because I think you have to have a certain level of experience just to understand, and apply it at the table. I think my stuff does speed up the process of getting that experience because I think it keys you into all the stuff that you might have been missing before. Like I've had many people tell me like, yeah, you sped up my process of, understanding behavior by like, a year or 2 or 3 or whatever, full-time playing, I think above all the experience, there's no substitute for putting in, the equivalent of a year or whatever playing full-time poker, whether that's spread out of a few years or whatever.
And what about the need for a third book? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. You study it all the time with all your heart. And just like poker strategy, which is always changing, I guess the physical and verbal tells, they're changing too, right? I mean, because you're spotting more things in your study.
To a certain extent, they're changing. I mean, I think how they change is the main way they change is where you see variety is when high-level players, experienced players play each other and they both know that they're experienced and they do little reverse things, like I'll give you one example. Like I've seen this a lot more in the last few years is where a good player versus a good player and they bluff all in, they go all in and they're bluffing and they call the clock on an opponent, that's kind of a goading behavior, which, if it's an inexperienced player, an amateur player, that's almost always going to be relaxation because bluffers don't generally want to call the clock and possibly frustrate an opponent. I've seen that more and more with good players versus good players where they understand how it probably will usually be interpreted as relaxation, so they're trying to use it as a second level, tell. So it's little things like that where it's like once a tell becomes more understood, once a behavior becomes more understood, like the good players are more willing to use it as a reverse tell versus another good player.
Help me out with this one. When I'm playing in a cash game, I find it quite easy, or at least I think I do, to spot tells, spot situations, spot strength or weakness when it's a hand not involving me, like when 2 other guys at the table are going at it. Sometimes when I'm in the hand, I don't know what it is, but I struggle with the same procedure. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I have the same thing. It's like it's much easier to spot stuff when you're out of the hand. You're more objective for one, but also it's just a matter of watching the person because, I mean, when I'm in a hand anyway, I'm not staring at the person the entire time. Like, I don't want to seem weird, and plus it's just uncomfortable. So I might miss some stuff that I might see if I was out of the hand and more willing to just watch someone. I don't like to stare at someone the entire time. It's just not my MO. I mean, some people do that, but I like to sneak glances and try to look at somebody out of the corner of my eye and stuff. So I think that's one reason, it's just, but mainly I think it's just you're more objective. Like when you're in a hand, you're thinking your bandwidth is focused on what you have and how to play it and not as much on the other person. And that's just natural. And that's another area where, experience comes into play because the more you have your strategy kind of mapped out in your brain, the more you can devote to subtler things like behavior.
All right, well, the good news is I'm not alone. The bad news is I got to keep working at it. Safe to say that most people are not aware of their own tells?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. I mean, it's definitely a thing you have to work at, and you still can find yourself doing things that, are tells. I mean, that's one thing that, even after years of playing, like I still catch myself, I'll be in a hand and I'll be like, would I have done that if I was bluffing? And find little things that are like, oh, that was probably a clue that I was relaxed, what I just did right there or what I said. So there can be lots of blind spots. I mean, definitely I think there's a lot of inexperienced players or even somewhat experienced players that aren't aware of all the ways information can leak out. And that's, that's why tells are valuable. Just, there's a lot of blind spots.
Can you give me, a few thoughts on false tells?
Yeah, I mean, I'm capable of doing them occasionally. I think they can occasionally be good ideas, but I think the situation has to be quite right. I generally say, like, I don't advise doing them unless you're quite sure they're a good idea, just because, for one thing, you never, it's hard to know what an opponent will draw from whatever behavior you do. It's hard to know how they'll interpret it. So it's either like you're muddying the waters or you're potentially doing something that they could actually read into and understand what you're trying to do. So, assuming they're good. But like if there's a spot where you think someone's a decent player and you're doing a tell that you think will be perceived in a certain way by a decent player, because they have the ability to read that, and that player thinks you're also an inexperienced amateur player and they're likely to read it a certain way, like that would be a spot where you could do something, that was a common tell and expect to get a common result. But, it's a danger because if you just oftentimes don't know how someone's going to read into things, because a lot of people just, for example, like a lot of people just use any behavior will make them more likely to call if you're betting. Some people just look for any reason to call because they like to call. And then if it's a good player, they might actually, like, your false tell might actually be a tell if you're inexperienced and you don't know what you're doing. I'll give you an example of that. Like, some people, when they are betting with a strong hand, like to try to give examples of like how they're nervous, and like try to act in a way they think is nervous. And like, so they act in a kind of weird ways that actually can be a tell, because while you're thinking you're acting nervous, a good player can see through that and be like, oh, this person wouldn't act this way if they were bluffing. So your false tells can actually become tells, if you're not that experienced.
I always like the one when someone checks to a person and that person looks down at their chips and starts humming and hawing with their hands, up and down, like, what am I going to do? They're tilting their head back and forth, and then they all of a sudden say, I'm all in.
I'm all in, I guess, yeah. Yeah, that was that classic Beth Shack video, which was like the most extreme example of that I'd ever seen, where it was like a WSOP, maybe a circuit event, I'm not sure, but her and Phil Hellmuth both had pocket aces. I don't know if you've seen that hand.
Oh, absolutely. That was definitely the WSOP. And Richie was sitting there with pocket kings, and he called.
That was a funny. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough spot. I think he said later he thought he beat somebody in that hand, but he thought one of them had aces. He thought, but he wasn't sure about the other one, and had more money than he thought. One of them had aces for sure, because both Hellmuth and her acted really weird in that hand.
Well, Hellmuth said afterwards that it was one of the worst calls ever. I mean, she was dancing. That's what Hellmuth said.
She was dancing and like the whole like, I guess I'm all in or something. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, that was a crazy hand. Aces and kings, man. Nothing gets better than that. Listen, I know you're busy. I really appreciate you taking time today. Quickly talk about the website. The book is Exploiting Poker Tells, the third in your trilogy. I guess you can find it on the website, which is readingpokertells.com. You've got the video series there. You're busy with the blog, and you're busy coaching too.
I've consulted for 2 World Series of Poker final table players for the main event. I've done a few other small things, but the main consulting work I've done is for the 2 WSOP players, Amir Lahavit and Max Steinberg, and I might do it again this year. We'll see. I didn't do it last year, but I'm gonna try to reach out and see if I can get anybody interested this year.
But you've got the video series as well. You've got the blog. I mean, you're keeping busy.
Yeah, the video series is at readingpokertells.video, and the main site's at readingpokertells.com. The new book's on the .com site. Yeah, you can see it if you select products, I think, and it's down there.
Well, listen, man, the World Series is coming up. Last question. How do you approach the World Series? Is it different for you than most players? Like, are you down there not only playing, but are you working it as well?
I think I might go down for a few days this year. Actually, I haven't been feeling that well health-wise, so I'm probably not going to play. I haven't actually played in a while. Yeah, for the main event though, I generally reach out to the final November 9 and see who's interested in doing that, and that's just a matter of, it's kind of interesting. I've written some blog posts about that process of analyzing the final table of the WSOP main event, and yeah, it's a matter of like, analyzing footage and from the main event, but also like if any players were in any other events, which happens a lot these days. For the more experienced players, you can find footage of them in other events, and it's a tough thing because most of them are pretty damn good. So it's unlikely you'll find anything, but it's more of just a covering your bases kind of thing, where you look for something and if you find something, it might be really valuable.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, you talk about value. I mean, there's so much money up top. Could you imagine if it's a heads up situation and something you pointed out to one of those players used it on the final hand to make a big caller? I mean, that would be the ultimate feather in your cap right there.
Right. Let's hope it's the right call.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. A Poker Player on Twitter, readingpokertells.com, the website. 3 books. You got to get them. Reading Poker Tells, Verbal Poker Tells, and now Exploiting Poker Tells. Zachary Elwood, thank you so much, man. Speedy recovery.
Hey, thanks. All right. Thanks, Derek.